Last year, I got a chance to see one of the most unusual watches I'd ever seen, hands down. In fact, you could say it was almost out of this world. It was the CIGA Blue Planet, a watch that combined an unusual design with modified movement to create an artistic experience you wore on your wrist. This year, they're back, and they're looking a little more black than blue. This is the new, all stealthed out Gilding version of the Blue Planet, or maybe Gilted version, which ups the ante from last year's version by trading in the titanium for a ceramic case and ceramic bracelet, as well as the dial now is complete with 24 karat gold. It's either plated or inlaid or something, they haven't really said specifically. But either way, there's 24 karat gold here. So if you thought last year's version was nuts, they've doubled down on that crazy. Now, if you're not familiar with CIGA, I kind of see them as a bunch of mad scientist designers who not only come up with designs that defy convention, but the crazy thing is they actually go ahead and build them. So it's no wonder that when the original Blue Planet came out, it won a GPHG award. I know I hadn't seen anything quite like it before, but evidently neither did anyone else. Overall, I like the original, and I thought it was a pretty cool, interesting concept. But for what it was and how it came across, I was a little hung up on that price. I honestly wasn't sure how it'd do once it hit the market. But evidently I was wrong, because it did well enough that they followed it up with this upgraded version. And before we get any further, I should mention that this watch was provided by the brand, and as far as I know, they're not going to ask for it back. Hence that promotional tag at the beginning. And one of the big reasons that I really agreed to do this review was that I wanted to get a good look at the ceramic on it. I was just curious how a smaller company would do with it. Anyway, that's enough of an intro, let's just get to it. With regard to the specs, you're looking at a watch that is 46mm wide, as well as tall. It is circular after all. It's also 16mm thick and comes in at a weight of around 145 grams on its ceramic bracelet, give or take a link or two. However, this is one where the specs don't really tell you the whole story. In fact, the specs might not even tell you half of that story. Because this one is a pretty unique case shape and design, so it wears very differently than you might think. Believe it or not, it's actually quite comfortable on the wrist. Don't get me wrong, it still looks huge, but you don't actually feel all of that on the back of your wrist. The case shape here is very circular or spherical, or heck, let's just call it what it is. It's a flying saucer. Imagine, if you will, that the Earth was some blacked out flying saucer cruising the cosmos with a sunroof over the Indian Ocean. Because essentially, that's what you have here. So it's only 46mm at that midline of the case. Above and below that, it tapers down. And one thing that I really love about this one is just how the curvature continues from the case to the extra large curvy crystal, creating this beautiful, polished, continuous flow across, giving it a bit of an outer worldly feel. Although, as you've probably seen here, there is a downside to that crystal as well. Because it's so large, because it's so curved, it just tends to pick up light and reflection all around it. And interestingly, this curvature also continues as you go to the case back, as the exhibition crystal also has a domed shape to it. So ultimately, what you wind up feeling on the back of your wrist is a much smaller surface area. There's also a shorter effective lug-to-lug than you might expect. As this is a lugless design, there are just these cutouts under the case for the spring bars. And as such, the effective lug-to-lug is actually pretty short. I think it's about 37mm from the spring bar to the spring bar. And that also helps with its wearability. Before we get too much further, I should probably talk about the dial design, and more importantly, how to actually read this thing, because I'm sure some of you are completely confused by it. And a lot of that also has to do with the customization they've done to whatever movement is actually in this thing. Now, I think I did a pretty good job the first time around, with the original version explaining how this thing worked. So I'm just going to be lazy and let Past Shane take it from here. As for how to read the watch, well, it's actually quite simple. Looking at the watch at the very outer edge, you have a fixed ring with your standard 12-hour markings. Then, just inside that, you have a ring with your minute indicators. And this ring actually rotates around every hour, basically acting as a minute hand. Which then brings us to the center 3D textured section of the Earth. which basically acts as an hour hand and does fully rotate every 12 hours. Now, on that topographical map, there's this very small nautical looking compass, and that acts as the marker you use to read the watch. In order to read the time, you just look at where that marker is pointing on both the minute ring and the hour ring, reading both of those in order to get the time. So with these two examples, you can see what 6 o'clock looks like, with that marker pointing at the double zeros as well as the 6. As well as this one, where the compass is just past the 10 on the hour indicator and sitting right at 10 on the minute. Thus, it's 10:10. It's rather straightforward to do, but a little bit more complicated and more interesting in terms of what's going on behind the scenes with the movement. As in order to accomplish this, CIGA had to adjust the gearing ratio. And this is something they're referring to as an asynchronous follow-up technology, which is a little wordy for my taste. With a normal movement, every hour that passes, the hour hand advances 30 degrees, right to the next indicator, as well as the minute hand does a full 360-degree rotation. So when you read that normal minute hand, you actually read it in reference to a fixed point on the dial. Whereas with the Blue Planet, the gearing ratio has been adjusted so that the minute hand actually advances 390 degrees instead of 360. Basically, it's doing a full rotation and then another 30 degrees, just so that it can catch up and sync up with the hour hand. Which is why with the Blue Planet, you can actually read both the hour and minute just by using a single reference point on the center section. Which in a nutshell is that whole asynchronous blah 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 technology. Now, that's about the best I can describe it, and if you are still a little bit confused, maybe go back and rewatch it, or just keep watching and pay attention to how this thing moves. I think eventually you'll get it. Alright, now back to the present. And with that older version, I'm sure you noticed that it had a blue and silver color scheme. Whereas here, it's jet black with gold. And I think this one, the newer Gilded version, actually looks a lot cleaner and sharper. But for the most part, this one does have the same pros and cons as the original. Starting with that it's amazing to look at. With the glare issue on the crystal, I don't think this one really translates across the screen just how cool it is. All of us reviewers always talk about depth when it comes to the designs, but this one is a whole other dimension when it comes to depth, where the outer worldly, shiny curvature of the case leads up to this translucent bubble with a small 3D model of the world slowly rotating underneath. It's unlike anything you've seen before, and in terms of presence, this one has it in spades. It's definitely eye-catching, and people are just going to stare at it trying to figure out what it is. And some might actually be amazed when you tell them it's a functional watch. There's also potentially a great message that goes into this one. One about cherishing the environment and how on this thing we call Spaceship Earth, we're all in it together. At least that's what I think they're trying to say with this one. But by nature, I am kind of cynical, and I can't help but point out there's some irony here, where they're promoting a populist environmental message with an expensive luxury item that uses precious metals. But this is a watch channel, we're not going to go there. Let's just focus on the watch itself. As for the negatives, they're also the same as the original. Namely, that while reading the watch is simple in concept, in practice, it's much more difficult. I think there's far more contrast with this Gilded version than the original. But even with that, the hour and minute markings are still very small. So they're not always the easiest to read, and especially if your eyes are getting older. Plus, most of us are going to be used to using a regular three-handed watch. So you're going to have to retrain yourself when you want to read this one, which is easily doable, but will take a little bit of time. And this, of course, always leads to that classic and eternal form versus function argument, which you could use this watch as a prime example of. The Blue Planet is also not very engaging. I mean, it is amazing to look at, and it will captivate you for a while when you first see it, just as you're trying to take everything in. And all those small details and the various land masses are amazing. But once you absorb all of that in, nothing here is moving very fast. And it gets a bit staticky and stale at times. So while you might feel a sense of wonder when you first see this one, that's something that may not last. Now, both versions have a very similar build and functionality, but they differ greatly in style. I think one of the weaknesses of the original Blue Planet was its color scheme. With its blasted case, bright blue rubber strap, and the more vibrant dial, well, for some, I think it came across as a little too gimmicky and maybe whimsical, as there were a few comments that said it looked too much like a toy, which is something I don't think you'll have a problem with the gilded version, and especially on its ceramic bracelet. With its all black and gold color scheme, it looks pretty sharp. Honestly, I'm not sure I'd go so far as to call this refined or sophisticated, because we are looking at basically a UFO, but I'd definitely say it's sharp. I mean, if they ever decided to make another Men in Black film, this watch would be perfect for that. It's large, it's odd, it's a bit unusual, and people will definitely stare at you when you wear it, but it's still a good looking watch. Let's start wrapping things up by talking about the bracelet and strap. The rubber strap it comes with is pretty much the same as the original. It's just here it's in black rather than blue, and on the watch I'd say it looks okay. It's a pretty good strap as far as rubber straps go, but I think it's the ceramic bracelet that really elevates this one beyond the original, as not only does it look fantastic, but it gives the entire thing a much more substantial feel in the hand. The butterfly clasp has a good action, and the ceramic links themselves have a nice, smooth, and really cool feel to the touch. It's overall a good bracelet, but there are a couple of issues here, and one of which really needs to be addressed. First, sizing it can be a pain. It's a pin and collar system with some pretty wide links. And one of my punch tools that I was using to try to size it just wasn't long enough to push the pin out. So I had to use another one that was a little bit longer. But after you eventually get it sized, it does wear pretty nicely, as those smaller links wrap around your wrist. And another thing about the bracelet, as well as the watch head itself, is that they are both fingerprint magnets, which is just how it is with ceramic, as well as that giant crystal. So there's a good chance you're going to be spending just as much time wiping this one down as you are admiring it. However, the bigger issue here is more how the bracelet attaches to the watch. The end links are open and it allows a spring bar just to slide in. And the spring bars they've provided have a pretty long handle on them. At least that's what I think you'd call this part. And that's in comparison to ones that come on the rubber strap and some ones I've bought from Barton. The problem here is that they're so long that they're actually restricting the movement of that end link, as it only rotates so far before that handle hits the edge of the case, which seems to be happening when I'm just wearing it on my wrist. It doesn't want to rotate any further than just what's naturally happening. And this concerns me for a couple of reasons. One, it's putting extra pressure on a very thin piece of steel, and long term might cause it to snap. Now, I don't think that's actually going to cause the bracelet to fall off your wrist while you're wearing it, but at the very least, it's going to be a pain in the ass to get that bracelet off the watch after that. As well as it might actually scratch the case. I know ceramic is pretty hard, so it might not, but I'd rather not find out to begin with. And lastly, on a watch of this price, this is just straight up half-assery. Someone should have seen this, and someone should have found a solution to this way before it ever got out. There's really not much excuse for it. As for the price, I believe they mentioned that the MSRP is going to be around $18.99, and I think at least in the short term, there's going to be a coupon code for $100 off. If they do, I'll include it down below, and that really brings it down to $1,799. And if you got some sticker shock there, feel free to take a minute to take that in. Normally, I like to start closing these things out by talking about value, but I don't really see much of a point here, as this is really more of a piece of art you're going to strap to your wrist than, say, a highly functional tool watch. And art typically defies logic. I mean, art exists for art's sake and not necessarily any specific purpose. And that's something that does cause a small divide in the watch world. Typically, I think this is on the higher echelons of the luxury world, but it does exist. Between those that are more practical, and those are the folks that are looking at this and thinking, do you know what else I could get for that price? And between those that just want to make a statement. And really, that's what this is. It's a statement piece. I like the concept of it, and I like what they're trying to do with it. It's an attention-grabbing, sharp-looking watch with potentially an important message, as well as a good conversation starter. But when it comes down to it, I'm really just a practical person. And someone like me is going to look at this, and as cool as it is, just question how much they'd actually wear it to justify that price. And on the off chance you're considering this as well, that's something you should really ask yourself too. This is a watch for someone who already has a large watch collection, who already has a ton of field watches, dive watches, dress watches, sports watches, all sorts of watches. And as such, they also have some fairly deep pockets. This is for someone who's looking for something completely different, yet still has a lot of style to it. And for them, I say go with your gut. This is art. Does it speak to you? If so, go for it. As for everyone else, well, next time we'll get a little bit more back to earth and back to reality. As usual, let me know what you think about the CIGA Blue Planet Gilded version down below. Although at this point, they should really just call this thing the Black Planet or the Gilded Planet, because that name is way too long. And as always, you guys know what to do down below. Like, comment, subscribe, thumbs up, thumbs down, whatever. Whatever you do, it helps the channel. I'm Shane, this is Relative Time, and I'll see you next time.